A major component of writing a good novel is ensuring you have an interesting, solid, engaging plot that makes sense and really hooks the reader. But that said, plotting a novel can be really challenging. So today I'm going to walk you through the 5 most common plot mistakes that I see whenever I am editing novels and offer you some tips on how to fix them. Because ensuring that your plot flows smoothly and effectively is going to be extremely critical to ensure that you are keeping your reader interested from the very beginning to the end. If you are working on a book, consider subscribing to my channel. I offer a lot of tips on how to write novels especially, as well as publishing advice if you are hoping to eventually bring your book into the world. So let's dive right in with the first plot mistake that I often see. It is convenient discoveries. So what I mean by this is a character finding a long lost letter or a newspaper clipping that has a really interesting tidbit of information that pertains to their story, or maybe they stumble across a diary of someone that is important to them and it reveals, all kinds of juicy secrets. This could also be a character conveniently running into someone on the street and then the events of the novel ensue from there, or someone randomly showing up at the door at the exact perfect time. We see these types of convenient discoveries in thrillers especially, just because there are often, different dominoes that have to fall in thrillers in order for the main point of suspense to unravel. However, all novels will have some of these convenient elements in them. And I want to say that having elements of convenience in your plot is going to be a necessity on some level. I'm not saying that you have to eliminate every element of convenience or every little convenient discovery that you find in your manuscript. What it's about is limiting those convenient discoveries so that you can help maintain the believability of your story. Because what happens is if you have too many of these, random sightings, or you have too many of these really exciting things that the characters just happen to stumble across, that's going to start to chip away at your reader feeling like this is really authentic and believable. You just want to make sure that you only limit them to the moments that are extremely critical to the plot, and you cannot have them happen in any other way. So what you're going to do to fix these convenient discoveries is go through your novel with a fine-tooth comb and determine where you can make a convenient discovery actually more complex or more challenging. What this is going to do is it could actually enrich the plot even further and make you explore an avenue that maybe you haven't, and it'll add depth to the story. And on top of that, it is going to ultimately make the story more believable because you're going to be relying less and less on those chance circumstances. The second plotting mistake I want to talk about is a vague timeline. This happens when it's really unclear when events in the novel are taking place in relation to each other, or it's unclear how much time has passed between 2 subsequent scenes. This ultimately makes it really difficult to follow the developments in the plot, and the reader can just get mixed up in their head and not really understand how things are unfolding on the timeline. So how you're going to fix this is at the start of every single chapter or section break, if you don't have delineated chapters, try to incorporate language that signals the passing of time to the reader. So one example would be, it had been 3 months since I got the job. So then we know, okay, we saw the character get that job, however many pages earlier, and we know that this scene happening now is taking place 3 months after that. And in some cases, especially if time plays a really important role in the novel, and you need the reader to be able to keep track of it, or if the novel takes place over a really significant amount of time, like, years or decades, it can also be really effective to use dates and or years in the chapter headings themselves, again, if you are using chapters. What this would look like is you would have chapter 1, and then right under it, it would say 1912. We immediately know that this chapter is taking place in 1912, and what that will do is then eliminate the need for you to use that language that I gave the example of to delineate the passage of time. You won't have to then start the paragraph with, it was 1912 and so did this, because the reader already is going to know it's 1912 because you included it right in the chapter heading. However, if you do go this route, I caution you to make sure you are consistent with it, and you always have the chapter heading with the year or the date attached to it, because Once you establish that as something you're going to provide to the reader is going to rely on it. So if you have it in chapter 1, it says 1912, and then you go to chapter 2, the reader needs to know, is that also in 1912 or are we now in 1914, for instance? So just be super consistent and reliable with it if you do go that route. The next plotting mistake I want to talk about is one I see in probably every single novel. It's what I call rabbit holes. This is when the narrative diverges from the main storyline to discuss something else for some amount of time. It could be just for one paragraph, or maybe in the worst cases, several pages or even a chapter, where it just isn't consistent with the main storyline and it doesn't seem significant or related. This could look like diving into a secondary character's backstory, but that backstory doesn't actually relate back to the main storyline in a significant way. Or it could look like you diverging to provide a bunch of historical or background context if it's a historical fiction novel, for example. This might be super interesting to you, and maybe you want to dive in and tell the reader everything about the year 1912 and what was going on in the world at that time. But to the reader, that could really just feel distracting and feel like a divergence from the storyline that they're trying to follow. This might also appear as some type of flashback that one of the characters is having, or a dream sequence that actually doesn't illuminate anything significant to the main events of the plot. The way to fix these is very straightforward. In most cases, it's going to be to omit them. And I know how difficult it can be to kill your darlings, so you might need to employ a beta reader or a professional editor to help you identify those areas that are going down rabbit holes, because to you, they likely don't feel like rabbit holes. You wrote them for a reason, but seeing it from that third-party perspective will help you identify them, and then you'll see, once you cut them out, the narrative is going to flow much more smoothly and swiftly. The next plot mistake I want to walk you through is lack of cohesion. What I mean by this is that the first part of the story, maybe the first third or the first half, looks nothing like the rest of the book. So this could happen if, for instance, you introduce a second character perspective 1/3 or halfway through the novel, or if you potentially jump really far ahead in time periods. So maybe the first half of the novel takes place when the protagonist is in high school, and then the second half you flip forward to when they are actually an adult. Why this becomes an issue and why it feels like a lack of cohesion is because, remember, your reader is going to become invested in whatever you present to them in those very first pages. So they're going to dive into this character's story, dive into what's going on in the beginning part of the novel, and then they're going to feel a little bit cheated if the novel actually takes an entirely different direction that they didn't see coming when they first were getting immersed in the story in its beginnings. So fixing this can be a tough one because it is often going to require some major restructuring. So think about your novel and think about what the first half looks like, what the focus areas are, and then think about what the second half is, and make sure that there is a cohesive crescendo of a plot line there. Make sure that they don't feel like two separate novels, because that can be an issue as well. You may end up realizing that you have to actually lean into one part of the story and omit the other one entirely, or save it for a sequel maybe. Or alternatively, you might have to cleverly switch between the storylines earlier in the novel. So let me give you an example. Say that the first half of your novel is from one character's perspective, and the second half of the novel is from their sister's perspective. What you're going to do is, instead of having it be this character and then their sister, it might make sense to, from the very beginning of the novel, have that main character and then the sister and then the main character and then the sister, and have their storylines interweave and mingle in that way. What that's going to do is, from the very beginning, when they are diving into the book, the reader is already going to know, oh, okay, this is about this character and their sister, both of them. Rather than in the original plot structure, you get the reader extremely invested in that first character, and they're going to think they're the only protagonist. So whenever the novel switches to talking about the sister and showing her point of view, they're going to be like, I don't really care about the sister. I just read 100 pages from this other character's perspective. What happened to them? So try to think about it from the reader's perspective. What are they going to be most interested in? What are you talking about in your first 50 pages? And make sure that there is a cohesiveness from beginning to end, so you don't disrupt the reader's experience in that way. The last plotting mistake that I often see in writers' manuscripts is what I call the snowball effect. What I mean here is reveals, usually in the last third or last quarter of the novel, that build on one another and get bigger and bigger and bigger like a snowball until they are just completely out of control and the reader can really no longer follow what's actually happening. What's happening here is that you as the writer are trying to make a really awesome plot climax, right? You're trying to show the reader all of these twists and turns and all of these revelations and make this really, really exciting read that, we've been building up to for the entirety of the novel up to that point. However, the way you're coming at it is almost too strong and you're not giving each of the revelations their own breathing room for the reader to really understand and reflect on the implications. So it just results in the reader getting overwhelmed and then feeling like those revelations weren't really earned. It might be easier to, again, use an example to kind of illustrate this. Say that the biggest climactic point and biggest twist in your novel is the moment that two characters find out they're related. That's cool. And then they discover that they're siblings. Okay, so that's another revelation that the reader is now having to grapple with. And then they discover that they're twins. And then it just kind of feels like that snowball effect again is just building and building, and now there's kind of 3 revelations that we're having to grapple with all at once instead of taking each of those piecemeal and understanding them one by one. This approach runs the risk of the reader feeling like the ending just didn't deliver that satisfying conclusion that they were looking for. They might say something like, the ending just really wasn't believable when all of those things started happening at once. Or they might say, it felt like the plot got out of control in the last third. So you want to make sure that you do fix this so that the reader feels like that most climactic point of your novel is also the most exciting. So what you're gonna do in this situation is really space out those revelations. Make sure that they're given their due time on the page. Have the characters reflect on them, talk about them, think about them internally before you hit the reader with another revelation. And then lastly, whenever all of the reveals are out on the table and the climax of the novel is over, make sure you do have a little bit of falling action. It doesn't have to be a ton, but just some closing passages that sum everything up and show us how the characters have evolved and how they are reacting to the changes that they have seen over the course of the novel. So I hope me calling out these mistakes helps you go back into your manuscript and see if maybe you're falling into some of these same errors. And ultimately, I hope it helps you strengthen your manuscript and feel great about the plot that you've developed. And let me know in the comments below if you've noticed any of these similar mistakes in your book or if you're having any other issues with plot. I'd love to have a dialogue and hear about what you're working on. And if you have a draft and you're in the process of going back through and potentially editing it, I recommend checking out my video on mistakes that you can catch when you're self-editing your own book. If you found this video helpful, it would mean a lot to me if you hit that like button below, as well as subscribe to my channel. Every week, I post a new video either with writing tips like this one on how to strengthen your book or tips on how to go about getting published if that is something that you're interested in down the line. Thanks so much for watching and happy writing.